This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with William Carroll, Professor Emeritus of English at Boston University. We will begin by taking a close look at Bill's recent book entitled Adapting Macbeth, A Cultural History. This series is funded with support from the Aoyama Gakuin University Institute of the Humanities and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today and spending I think this is your Friday evening, and we hope we're not getting into your supper time too much, but thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
I wanted to start off with your book, recently out, Adapting Macbeth, A Cultural History. Mm-hmm. And I expected, Bill, when I began this book, what I guess a lot of people would expect, and that is we're going to look at a kind of seminal Shakespearean text and see how that text was adapted through history. And that's interesting enough, but at the very beginning, you show us that this Shakespearean text from the 1623 folio is flawed, and also is part of a longer, much longer history of this Scottish narrative, I think from the 11th century. Right. And in fact, part of that stream of adaptation is the intervention of the Shakespearean text. It's a big intervention, but it's part of a much longer history of narrative. Right. And at one point I began thinking, well, yeah, we're getting a lot of Macbeth here, as much Macbeth as we would want. And that's great. But there's something else going on here. There is something else being said, maybe something yet unnamed about how a narrative, and in this case, a sort of imperfect narrative, continues through history and through the generations.
Well, I think it's important to, I thought it was important to start with the fact that Shakespeare's play, which is what normally we would take as the starting point for any history of adaptation, is already 500 years belated in terms of Macbeth's narratives, which began shortly after his death in the most minimal form and became more and more encrusted with elements of the story, characters added, characters invented, ghosts invented, witches invented, Banquo invented, and so on, until Shakespeare had in Holinshead a version of the story that had been worked over by many people with many axes to grind and many different ideological approaches for 500 years. And now we're 500 years later, roughly. And that's where we are. His is the Everest of that line, you might say, but not the only one, that's for sure.
Well, I wanted you to go into the textual element to begin with here, and that might be boring to a lot of people. It isn't to me. In your career, you've done quite a lot of textual editing, and you know quite a lot about it. And this folio version, just for like my students, there's this one version, and there's some problems with that version.
Right. And as I suggest, the nature of the folio version, which has, let's call them problems as opposed to flaws, is in many ways the impetus to the history of adaptation since 1606. In other words, my argument basically is that adapters since then have often, if not always, seen something that they found problematic or flawed or erroneous or lacking in the folio text, such as the issue of flayance at the end. And their adaptation is an attempt to, as it were, heal or cure or repair what they see as something that is not perfect. And so if you allow that premise, then almost anything goes, and of course anything has gone with the adaptations. Uh,
Yeah, I know this is very strong in the later 17th century, where the Dryden and the
right,
neoclassicals, but they felt, okay, we have some good raw material here, but obviously it needs to be cleaned up a bit.
right,
And
right.
the Lear needs another ending, and we need to do some other things over here. But you're dating this earlier
I dated to Davenant actually,
to William Davenant, to that,
16,
yeah,
1663, 4. And I'd always known about Davenant's adaptation, but when I began working through the various categories that I do in the book, I often found myself going back and seeing that Davenant was the first in many ways to do certain things. He was the first to try to produce a symmetry where there isn't any by adding scenes with the Macduffs. He
yeah,
has Lady Macduff and Lady Macbeth meet and have a conversation where they complain about their husbands.
yeah.
Uh, he adds he he adds in Duncan's ghost. He brings Fleance and Donalbain back at the end of the play. He was the first to do all those things.
Well, there's
Uh,
no Duncan's ghost in the 16 in the first folio. Is that
no,
right? Yeah.
correct.
There's-
And I've always wondered about that. You'd think that Macbeth would be haunted by the ghost of the king that he
yeah.
murdered, but no, that he personally murdered. But no, he's
Yes.
haunted by the ghost of Banquo,
Yes.
and you could argue that that one reason for that is Banquo is significant in genealogical terms as his son, as Fleance and his descendants will become the inheritors of the throne.
Yeah.
But still, it's a little surprising. It's a little
Yeah.
surprising, you know.
Well, we tend to look at these adaptations and go, oh, well, those people just did not know just how great Shakespeare was. But then we get into our own frame of thinking, our own
Yeah,
framework. And one
yeah,
thing this book did, in terms of my view of Macbeth, I really am. I was just trained in the whole idea that there is a kind of a justification at the end, that the good guys win in the end, and yet when you look at this play, there's
yeah. Who
yeah, who are the good
who are the
guys?
good
Yeah,
guys? Exactly. It's not so clear. Um, well, that certainly, even from Davenant on, the so-called royalist interpretation or the authorized version in which the good guys win, evil is punished. This is the kind of line that for a couple of hundred years, most productions and most editors and most critics were trying to follow. But even in Davenant, there are some instabilities in that kind of ideological approach, in which it's not so clear exactly what's happened, whether the right of lineal succession is upheld or isn't upheld at the end of the play.
Mhm.
And by the 19th century, there clearly are very different readings of what's going on in terms of, especially the politics of the play.
Yeah,
And in the 20th century, it seems quite bifurcated to me.
yeah,
There are plenty of standard interpretations and productions of Macbeth, the so-called normalized version or the normative version of Macbeth.
yeah,
But then there's this incredible strain that comes from the 1920s on, in which the play seems vastly darker and less secure in its optimism and
yeah,
far more critical of Malcolm, of Duncan, and and uh, and reevaluates the witches at the same time.
yeah.
So I would say certainly the 20th century has seen the greatest shift, but I think there's been in the attempts to correct the play a recognition uh, that the play wasn't giving the proper message to begin with all along.
Yeah. Well, I had to kind of reevaluate my image of Duncan in particular, because you brought out, and
Mm,
of course it's there, right there in the text,
yes.
in the Shakespearean text, that Duncan is not really part of this battle. He's sending people out to do his dirty work. and
Right.
of course they're being attacked, but and he's a little on the arrogant side, but feeling that he can just offer out these little dishes and so forth. I think I was biased by Macbeth's lines before, while he's considering into the three
Mhm.
things he considers. He can't kill his king, and the king has just been good to him, and he can't kill a kinsman, and he can't kill a house guest. That's right up
Right.
there with the and so you have this feeling of you get from Macbeth a feeling about Duncan that is not in the rest of the play, and there is that.
Well, yes, but of course Macbeth says the best things about Duncan after he's killed him, and he's he he's remembered a lot more fondly than at the
Yes.
beginning. And of course, there's the scene where Duncan names Malcolm his successor,
Yeah.
and the text is so subtle there,
Yeah.
in which what is Macbeth's reaction to that? Well, we know what it is when he has the aside at the end of that
Yeah.
scene. I think Kurosawa's film does a great job of that. He just Macbeth and Banquo, Washizu, and just look at each other,
Yeah.
and you can just see his eyebrows twitch, and that's it.
Yeah.
That says everything.
That's everything. Yeah.
There's something really wrong with what, at least in Macbeth's mind, with what Duncan is doing, and critics like David Norbrook have gone back to look at the kind of discourse, the political discourse of the period, and suggested that, in fact, it was true that what Duncan is doing is altering the current mode of succession in medieval Scotland, and whether he did it in the play or in history are two different things. But this is the period in Scottish history in which it moves from elective to hereditary succession. And so
Yeah.
that sort of is there. Norbrook points out that it's sort of muted compared to what it is in Holinshed and other histories, but it's there, and it's what upsets Macbeth. He should have been the one named,
Yeah.
because he is the greatest thing. He is the most, and he's in the parallel family.
Yeah.
Duncan and Macbeth are cousins, and so he should have been named as the next king, but he's not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so you know,
Again, I was influenced by that royalist way of thinking, maybe that carries forth from the 18th century. In my own training, in my earlier readings of the play, and yet when you look at Tudor history, that's one of the big things. The idea that here this play is being played for James I,
mhm,
and that he was preceded by a line of people who failed in providing that son, that male heir,
right,
and that threw everything on the table. Are we going to have a feminine queen, a woman who is
mhm,
queen, a woman who is monarch, and you had two of them, and then after that, the person who succeeded is the elected one through
yes.
a process.
Well, but remember, James came to the throne not through Parliament or through
Yeah.
election, but through his
Yes.
claim of lineal descent.
Yes,
Even
going up
though
and over and down. Yeah, yeah,
even though Henry VIII had excluded the line of Margaret from the succession, nevertheless, that was his claim. And of course, he took his genealogy. That's why the line of kings business is so important in
yeah,
Act Four. James took his genealogy. He had a hired genealogist to write his history back to Fergus or to Adam.
yeah,
Um, he made the connection to Wales through
yeah,
Fleance's son, who flees to Wales.
yeah,
Fleance flees to Wales, and his
yeah,
son is born there.
yeah,
Comes back because if you're descended from Welsh royalty, then that gives you the English kingship line as well.
yeah,
So there are genealogies that were produced by James's supporters or by his own instigation that
yeah,
trace him back to the English, to the Scots, to the Welsh, to Adam, to Fergus, anybody you could think of, to the Saxons,
yeah,
anybody you could think of who had a line that might be part of lineal descent. That was James's move.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, and I misused the word election. I was thinking more of consensus, where you
yes,
have there is a among the nobles there's a general agreement that okay this and it happened with Mary. She
yeah,
basically just went into London and said I'm queen, and she had the public behind her, and with that momentum, so
hmm
there was never this moment where it was decided by whatever higher council or whatnot. This just you made the strongest argument you could make to be the monarch, the next monarch, and
right,
Macbeth had that argument in any of this narrative history.
right. It
And I,
also
yeah,
it also helped that James had Cecil working behind the scenes and having
oh
a secret correspondence,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then declaring, "Hey, Queen Elizabeth gestured on her deathbed. She nodded. She
yeah,
didn't speak. She nodded that James should be her successor." Well, it seemed obvious, and it seemed obvious to everybody except Catholics in particular,
yeah, yeah.
and
Well,
the Jesuits in particular. So,
yeah,
any rate, so the history of reading this play as a James-centric play
yeah,
is strong, and I don't want to deny it at all. And
yeah,
certainly, it does seem in many ways, it's a play written in part to appeal to, if not to James personally, to the current hot interest in London and in England generally, to this Scottish monarch of theirs.
yeah,
He was new. There were other plays. There was anonymous play, Malcolm, King of Scots in 1602. There was the play, the Tragedy of Gowrie in 1604, which was
yeah,
suppressed after two performances
yeah, yeah,
because it must have seemed too close to what was obviously fake news that James had had promulgated about how he escaped heroically from the Gowrie conspiracy.
yeah.
There were lots of Scots in London at this time. Ben Jonson had recently been imprisoned for mocking Scots accents in Eastward Ho.
Oh,
So it's not surprising that this play with James's witchcraft pamphlets and so forth had been republished, and so on and so forth.
yeah,
Uh, so it it's very tempting to read the play and to see the play and to read adaptations in terms of how it represents James or undermines him or whatever. So
yeah.
I had to do that. Of course, you have to do some of that, but I tried to stay away from letting that dominate what I was trying to do, because there are plenty of things in that play that aren't related to Duncan at all,
Well,
really.
at the very beginning, you list what it is about the play that captures the imagination from generation to generation. There's several things. It's about marriage. There's a
Yeah,
domestic element in this play. There's, of course, the kingship that we've been talking about,
right.
ambition, some of those basic deep forms and human
Absolutely.
existence that
Shakespeare's
capture.
happiest couple,
they,
as they've been
they're
called.
fine, yeah,
The only happy marriage in Shakespeare, until it's not.
until it's not.
Till it's
Uh,
not, right.
and really, it's not that the marriage itself breaks down. It's just that they are just under pressure from the things that they both have agreed to do. Uh,
Yes. Well,
and
their relationship, of course, could have been a whole book in itself.
yeah,
And the way
yeah,
in which they've been represented and the way in which the dynamic between them works out in the play. I mean, it's been a subject of fantastic interest for, well, certainly since the 17th century, in
yeah,
which attempts to explain Lady Macbeth follow the same kind of pattern as other elements of the play. She seems to be lacking something. Her motivations are not spoken
yeah.
in the play text, in the folio
Her,
text,
her
and
motherhood. Yeah,
so they're provided.
yeah,
They're provided, and I used probably not very accurately, but I used this notion from Foucault that what's happening in these adaptations is that they're an attempt to produce a kind of more docile text. He talks about discipline producing docile bodies, and
yeah. From
I think,
discipline and punish that
yeah,
line. Yes.
yeah, and I think that
Yeah,
something like that goes in almost all cases, in most of the cases that I look at. an adapter is trying to make sense of something,
Yeah.
and is trying to bring it into a kind of coherence that is understandable for the period of the time, the age
Yeah.
of the person involved.
Yeah.
Now, I should also say that there are plenty of adapters who are not doing that at all.
Yeah.
They're taking a story that, like the Brecht mystery story.
Yeah.
Uh, Brecht said that's a great story, and it suits him in a different way to play with that. Or anti-colonialist adapters.
Yeah.
They don't care about all this other stuff. What they see is Shakespeare, the hegemony of Shakespeare, and they want to undermine that or talk back to it, as Martha Rosett says. They want to rewrite that in some way,
Yeah.
and they're not trying to rationalize or normalize the play. They're trying to blow it up, and
Yeah.
that's another way. Like Heiner Muller, that's another way of adapting of adaptation is to blow things up.
Yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
the Charles Merowitz has the collage approach,
mhm.
in which he simply rearranges. It's I don't know if you've read that play of his,
No.
Merowitz's Macbeth. It's at first you think, oh, this is a gimmick, like Dada. You tear up a poem and put it in a hat, but it makes sense as a play. He
Mhm.
takes all the lines. He doesn't invent lines, as I read. He may invent a few lines, and then he puts them in different places than play and has different characters speak them. And the result is a fascinating play. It's hard to make through in a way because you're thinking, wait, this is Act 3, but here it is in Act 5. If you really know the play, it's difficult. But if you don't really know the play, you don't see what he's doing.
Right. Right. Right.
So,
Well,
uh,
I wanted to talk a little bit about your narrative structure in the book, in the sense that you accept right off the bat that you're not going to be able to be comprehensive, and you're not going to be able to give everything its proper due, and
right,
that you're not going to be able to follow a linear history. Really, at one point it breaks up, and I believe you use the Deleuzian notion, with the
yeah,
Deleuzian Guattari, the rhizomatic kind of
yeah,
surfacing of everything, and you just see these roots all over, and that goes eventually to the globe. But you break it up into areas, politics.
hmm,
You see a kind of line of continuity between Brecht and the modernist and that kind of
right,
theater, and then a kind of continuity along the other line in racialized theater, and also other
hmm,
types. And there are, I believe, 8 chapters. So
yes,
I'll let the reader see that structure. But I think that number one, is very, very impressive that you move from the textual elements of this into the critical elements and catch these strings. And I think that's a real that you're catching these channels that do go
hmm,
through history.
hmm,
Things are kind of consistent up to Garrick in the 18th century. You can kind of track that line from Shakespeare's period up through the 18th century, but things split off very quickly, don't
right,
they? Go into
right,
Europe and then globally.
yes. Well, thanks. That's a good summary. I would say that I'm keenly aware of what I couldn't do in the book in terms of uh, topics, Chinese opera, uh, other. I mean, my own limitations were, of course, linguistic. I can't read anything but European languages
Mhm.
and English. And so I had to rely on translations and secondary accounts of lots of things. And that's why uh, certainly one area of the book I think that's lacking is an analysis of Asian and African productions and adaptations and so on. But I did deliberately decide not to try to do just a chronological history, but a kind of tropological history in which I take different topics. So, I mean, I move from politics in the first chapter to music in the eighth chapter, or
Right.
the way in which novels have taken up the play in chapter 6, I think it is. Um, and I wanted not to do a traditional, you know, historical straight line. I didn't think it was possible And there were too many vertical different ways of going at the play as opposed to simply following a historical line. The other thing is that there are wonderful stage histories of the play. There are three or four of them already that have been up through, I don't know, year 2000 or so.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
There's the very good stage histories. There's a great collection of essays, Shakespeare on Screen, Macbeth. I was in that seminar. I have an essay in that
Yeah.
on film versions, and then there are many more recent accounts of Macbeth on film. And so, in a way, certain things have been done. Like I explain in the book that I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on Kurosawa's film,
Right.
even though I think it's probably the greatest adaptation of the play that exists, because
Yeah.
it's received phenomenally great criticism and scholarship. And so I tried to place it in this line of tropes and themes that I pursued. So as I said, this may be one of the world's great rationalizations, but I was reaching for breadth more than depth in every case. And some things I go
Yeah.
into in more depth, but in general, I wanted to look at this sweep of how it had been adapted. I
Yeah.
was also, of course, I faced a word count limit from my
That's right.
publishers.
That's right. Yes.
There's only so much you can do.
Yeah, we've had other guests that have talked about the word count, and the thing is that that's fair, and it's I do not envy this business of in adaptation theory and history of adaptation. You have on one end you have theater productions that you know about through reviews that you've never seen and will
Right,
never see, and
right,
then on the other end you have the film like Kurosawa, and you can go through that and you can present your own critical analysis, which I think you did very well in the book with that particular film. There's that, and then there's the other thing that you talk about that I found very engaging, and you've touched on it already. That is moving from culture to culture, right? I was
hmm
not born Japanese with two Japanese parents to go through Japanese school and that kind of learning, and so I'm not going to come to this film with the same kind of awareness of what Kurosawa might be doing. But then again, he's very I'm sorry, very well aware of the fact that he is internationalizing. He's taking an international theme in
right.
to Japan, but he's also trying to give something back out very clearly in the way he set that film up. And this, I'm using him as an example. I'm in Tokyo now, but you could
Mhm.
say this about almost everybody you're talking about in the international scene.
Right.
And so, say with Kurosawa, you have the title with the spider, the Kumo no Sujo. So the spider and the nest or the web and the
Yeah.
castle, no way you're going to be able to sell that back to the international audience. That would spider web castle. Yet
Yeah.
in that really works as a
Yeah.
binding theme, to sort of superimpose onto the play and to the film in his case.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's interesting because there are so many elements in that film that are not related to the folio text. Fine. And yet, there's a way in which he's gotten to the heart of a lot of it. Uh, and in some ways, has represented what we were discussing earlier, that political kill the king
yeah,
uh, uh, move that is, well, we associate it with English and Scottish politics of the 17th century, but he associates it with a different kind of parallel culture in the 17th century
yeah,
and makes it extremely modern, it seems to me,
oh yeah,
uh, especially because even though you'd say, oh, it's a very traditional kind of film because it's samurai, it's setting in the samurai period. But
yeah,
I think it's a uh, a very modern take on the play because of the circularity of the film, in which it begins in the fog and you see the ruins
Mm.
of the where the castle was, and then it ends there again, and it's just this endless cycle, like the wheel of the witch,
Hmm.
that goes on and on, and the songs that the witch speaks about,
Yeah.
the folly of men and their the inevitability of what happens again and again and again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The spinning and the spiders.
but that's right out
Oh,
of
yeah.
that's 20 years before Jan Kott, and that's right out of that kind of move.
Shakespeare,
Uh,
our contemporary, right? Bring
yes,
Shakespeare
right.
into our own experience. And that was so influential at that time, and I think it still is.
Hmm.
That notion that now I push back sometimes because when, we as teachers sometimes you have to say, hey, this is a historical word, and you just
Right.
have to learn this, or you're just not going to get it. The joke's not going to
Yes.
make any sense. Uh, and so I think you can push the contemporary, making everything contemporary, because Jan Kott is, we think, maybe 60s, more or less a kind of 60s
Yeah.
critic, and that's now half a century ago. So
Right. But his influence is
it's
it's
still
like
there.
it's like in teaching theory courses, for instance, to our graduate students. I mean, I'm retired now, but when we were doing that, when I was doing that, I would teach Foucault, and you realized that Foucault was hardly ever mentioned anymore by anybody writing critical theory, and yet his ideas, his approach, have been subsumed and are just there in a way. And I think Kott's ideas are like that as well.
Yeah.
Kott, you know, theater critics always liked Kott vastly more than academic critics. Academic
Uh-huh.
critics took him to task and tut tut,
Uh-huh.
that's not right, and, that sort of approach. But this is a case in which production history has, it seems to me, had a greater impact back on academic criticism in some ways, through Kott. That his approach has simply been uh, in the bloodstream. It's there, and when you see a production now in which Malcolm turns into a killer,
Yeah.
um, that goes back. Well, it's not only Kott, but let's say he most powerfully dramatized it, and Ionesco and Heiner Muller and David Gregg, they all look back to Kott in certain ways.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Now, I wanted to ask you also about the what I see in this book and what I see in your career is something that I find to be rare. And this usually when you're dealing with someone who's there's the textual editor, and
Mm-hmm.
there's the person who is geared toward that. I'm not really one of those people. I don't have that kind of discipline. I don't think I've never really taken it on. And then there's the bibliographer, the bibliophile, which
Mm-hmm.
might be a kind of pejorative term, but I'm a little bit more in that ilk. I like that. And then there is a cultural historian who can take all of these details and shape them. And then there's the literary critic or critical theorist, and
Mm-hmm.
you have all of those elements in this book. Uh,
Well, everything but the bibliophile, maybe.
Well, there is a compendious that you have. There's, if you digitize this book, you would have a fairly good bibliography.
Yeah.
Of, now there are others out there, but still, you bring up some things that I haven't seen before.
Well, I have to say, if you looked at my CV, you saw that I started out by publishing on. Actually, I started out by my first published article was on Vladimir Nabokov, but
Yeah, yeah,
my Shakespearean career started out on the comedies, and I had two books on the comedies. When I was approached about doing an Arden edition, the Arden 3 series, I asked for tragedies or measure for measure or something. And I was told in a kind way, well, we see you as doing the early comedies. I said,
You're a comedy guy.
you're a
Yeah,
comedy guy. I said, I
yeah,
don't feel like a comedy guy. And once you're sort of pegged, And in fact, since my dissertation, my first book was on a critical reading of Love's Labor is Lost, 25 years later, or however long it was, when the New Cambridge Shakespeare needed someone to take over the edition of Love's Labor is Lost that would foundered in their series, uh, they asked me because I'd done a book on it 25 years before, and I hadn't
Yeah.
really even looked at the play since then. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I was seen as a comedy guy, but I can tell you how this whole project began. Began on a bus ride in 1994 at the Shakespeare Association meetings in Albuquerque. We were going to Santa Fe, and I was sitting next to Karen Henry, who was the executive editor of Bedford Books, and two volumes of that had come out to that point, Taming of the Shrew and Russ McDonald's Reader. And Karen said, "Bill, how would you like to do a Bedford edition?" I said, "Well, that sounds interesting. What do you have in mind?" And she said, "As You Like It." And I said, "No."
No.
No. So I did, I did
You did
Macbeth.
Macbeth, yes.
Yeah. And that came out in 1999. And
But you,
that's,
you were also working on Fat King Lean
yeah,
Tiger. That's where I kind of got on board. You see, that's more
right.
in my formative. So
Well, that's true. But I was almost done with that
yeah.
when she asked me to do this Bedford
Uh-huh.
thing. And so I said, I want to do something different. And so I picked that up. And since then, I have had many other things I've done, but I've been interested in this play for a long time.
Yes, yeah, this isn't something that sprung up in the past even
No,
5 or 10 years. This is something that uh, uh, well, let's talk about comedy for a period. I'm finding comedy to be a lot more difficult year after
sure.
year. The more I learn about any given comedy that I teach or that I try to write about, I'm just going, I really kind of wish this were not a comedy. I wish it were,
Right,
because comedy is hard. It really is hard.
right. Tragedy is easy, comedy is hard. Um,
Yeah, that
I
that
mean,
old adage, isn't it? Yes,
the worst thing is when you're teaching an undergraduate class some of the comedies and you have to explain a joke. I mean, that's when you have to show them a video of a great production,
that's it. Nothing kills a
to
joke
get a
like
sense
explaining
of
it.
what's,
Yeah.
yeah. For example, Love's Labor is Lost. I mean, I started on that play because I couldn't figure it out, in graduate school. And so I thought, well, okay. And I didn't think the criticism on it was very interesting at the time. So I said, I'll work on that. And I had not seen a production of that play until after I'd finished my dissertation, at which point I realized it's terrific on the stage.
Uh-huh.
A great production is fantastically funny
Hmm.
on the stage. A bad production is not so much fun, but I've seen some great productions, and that's when
Yes.
I realized even a play like Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is often called Shakespeare's worst play, has a lot of interest on the stage,
Yeah.
far more interest than academic critics have sort of made it out to have.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think comedy is difficult and hard, but the one thing I've really not written on was the history plays. Don't
Yeah.
don't ask me why. I'm not
I
sure.
am.
I
It's
mean,
just that you weren't guided in that direction by whatever forces are out there.
I think I'm coming to it,
Yeah.
coming to them. But
You were guided into the direction of Middleton. And I wanted
yes,
to spend a little bit of time on Middleton, how you crossed over from Shakespeare to Middleton and why Middleton.
right. Well, there. That's another one of those examples of serendipity, in which I was at a conference at the Clemen Library in Munich, and I don't know, sometime in early 1990s,
Mhm.
and Brian Gibbons was there, and he
Mhm.
was then the sole general editor of the New Mermaids series. So he
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
we'd given papers and met each other and so forth. So he said, we're looking for some new editors. You have any interest in, doing a play. I'd never edited anything at that point.
Uh-huh.
And I said, well, sure. What do you got? And so he mentioned a couple of plays. And I settled on Women Beware Women because I had liked it when I read it in graduate school. And I thought it's a extremely interesting play. So that's how I got started on that. And then once that happened, a few years later, well, several years later, I was invited to become one of the general editors of the series myself,
Yeah.
along with Tiffany Stern and
Yeah.
Brian for a while.
Yeah.
By the way, Tiffany and I are stepping down at the end of 2022 so that they can have some new blood and new developments and new lines.
That's the
in
new
that series.
mermaid. That's the,
Yeah,
yeah.
New Mermaid series.
Well, that's the end of an era. But I'm certain that whoever takes over will be very good. That's a very strong. It has its own history now.
It goes way back. It
It
goes
goes
way
way
back.
back, and
But I'd have to say Brian was, that he was the generational leader for
yeah,
a long time of that
yeah,
series. And Tiffany and I came in, sort of take the load off him. And also it was a period when we were at that time expanding a little bit. Now not so much, I think.
I think Tiffany is doing some work with Arden.
She's one of the general editors of the Arden Four, so
Yeah,
she's
and
got
I
her
looked
plate
at,
full.
how can you? Well, I spoke with her about a year ago on this series, and when we finished, I'm thinking, how does she do all of this? How can she
And
possibly?
she's a phenomenon, I have to say.
Yeah,
I
and
love
still
her.
be just this happy, nice person.
She
You
is.
think that,
She's
yes,
very generous too.
yeah,
Yeah. So
yes,
we were yin and yang in many ways different, but we worked great. We
yeah.
worked well together. And
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a lot of good stuff, and this Arden series that your book is part of is. I'm very impressed. I'm with the series. The well, this is a little bit inside, but I have a couple of things that were stuck in the mud over the Corona or the COVID period,
yeah,
just stuck in the mud. And you go, well, my goodness, guys, by the time this thing comes out, it's not even going to be pertinent anymore. And
yeah,
that has not happened I don't think that's happened here. I've seen a steady flow and things kept it kept the ship going, downriver or whatever
right.
metaphor you want to use. And I'm very impressed with that. That signals an extremely dedicated and good editorial staff that was able to adapt to a very difficult time.
Yes. Well, all credit to Margaret Bartley
Yeah,
for
yeah,
steering that ship. She's
yeah,
quite extraordinary.
yeah,
And
and keeping things.
Mark Dudgeon now does the critical side of things. So she does the editor. She supervises the Arden Four and other projects.
Yeah,
But she was the one who guided Arden through the last 10 or 15 years, and is fantastic. So
yeah,
I've been lucky. I had wonderful mentors as I learned how to edit, from
yeah.
Brian to Richard Proudfoot, in particular at Arden.
Yeah. There's no manual out there, is there? That's one of the
No,
reasons I've shied away because
no, you just make your mistakes and hope someone points them out to you.
uh, I go to, and I realize this, it was later than it should have been. I usually have over time, I've gone to, for Hamlet, for instance, let's go back to Harold Jenkins, right? And
Right.
I'm thinking up until this year, this publication of Harold Jenkins, I'm going to get almost everything I need, right?
Mm,
And then after that, I found, well, there are a couple of things that were missed in there
yes.
that even Jenkins missed, and he didn't miss much that I've been able to see. But that's where you go. You go to that textual edition to
Mm,
it's reliable with things that are so spread out all over everywhere, all these publications and so forth, and yet it's still very difficult to get everything in.
yeah. But Jenkins, well, of course, the current Hamlet in Arden 3 is 2 volumes. So,
Yes, yes,
but Jenkins Arden 2 is quite a monumental
it is.
achievement.
It is monument.
Uh, I've I have given away most of my, I'm trying to downsize my library, which is not
Yeah.
being very successful.
Yeah.
And so I kept only a few Arden twos, and Jenkins is certainly one of them. But of course,
Yeah.
he had his own way of seeing the play and of seeing the relation among the three texts. And it's sometimes, well, for instance, in the Rogan Peasant Slave soliloquy, he doesn't permit Hamlet to say or to shout, "Oh, vengeance."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
He dismisses that line. He says that's just an actor's interpolation.
Uh-huh.
Well, well, yeah. So, wasn't Shakespeare an actor there? Well, I mean, there are different ways still, and I think that the Arden three version with Anne Thompson and is quite good, and
Well,
has taken a few things and made us look at them in slightly different ways.
yeah, this brings up something that I wanted to ask you about also, is that it involves the fact that we're kind of finding out, and I'm not sure how reliable these new digital methods are in scanning and being able to
Oh,
identify signatures and so forth. And that's a whole different thing. But
right.
there is a much more open-mindedness toward the notion of Shakespeare collaborating on plays that we had heretofore given him primary authorship.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
you have experience working with one of the great collaborators, Middleton,
Yeah,
and it does make sense that everybody else seemed to do it, and certainly
right.
Shakespeare did too. It's a matter of where and to what extent.
Yes. There's no question that Shakespeare uh, collaborated with various people from the beginning to the end of his career, with Fletcher at the end, maybe with Nash at the beginning, with Titus
Mhm.
Andronicus. Um, and
Mhm.
somewhere in there, Middleton was, uh, if Shakespeare's, you might say, successor as the chief playwright of the King's Men, and had his hand is visible in some of the plays, and particularly in Macbeth,
Mhm.
because as you know, the two songs that the witches sing are taken from Middleton's play The Witch, or or at least we can say that in Middleton's play The Witch, the full texts of those songs are present. So it's likely that the version that we have in the folio is has Middleton's, if not his thumbprint, his pinky
Yeah,
into the play.
it's pinky. Yeah,
I don't think he Middleton revised the play nearly as much as, for example, Gary Taylor thinks.
yeah,
But there's no doubt that there was some influence, and more than influence, you might say, in terms of actually producing some text that wasn't in the original, that wasn't in whatever version of the manuscript reached the folio editors. The original, if there was an original manuscript, there must have been multiple, palimpsestic versions of
yeah.
the
Palimpsestic.
of the
Yes.
text.
Uh,
Um, I think we have, yeah.
yeah.
So that's another element of the book that I was conscious of. I was using. You have to take the first folio text, since that's the earliest original text of the play.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't fetishize it as the only Shakespearean, the only way in which Shakespeare is present. And on the other hand, you can't reconstruct what happened in 1605-6, what it was like exactly.
Yeah.
Uh, thing, you know, thing, Things are just not very clear, I would say, about this play, which is another reason why it lends itself to adaptation.
Yeah, that's getting back to Macbeth. Yes, because we would see, if we had the earlier version or versions, far more. And that's probably one reason why Macbeth is up there with
Mm-hmm.
the adaptable plays. You made
Yeah,
a list, and
right,
of course Hamlet, but then Hamlet, we do have that. Those three early editions do give you a lot more to work with in terms of
right,
what's even not there, right?
right,
Uh,
right. Several thousand lines more.
several
That's
thousand lines.
that's the thing about Macbeth. I mean, it is relatively short. It's not the shortest play. It's
Yeah.
not the other tragedies are shorter, and there's of course the argument that some of the texts that we have were written were versions that were meant to be read and or cut down.
Yeah.
Lucas Ernst's sort of argument about
Yeah.
reading Shakespeare, and
Yeah.
others are versions that were meant to be played,
Yes.
uh, and therefore they're shorter and more compact. And like the first quarter of Hamlet maybe was a playing version,
Hmm.
uh, and so it makes sense that Macbeth, the text we have, which is relatively short compared, much shorter than Hamlet or Richard
Yeah.
III, but everything else is.
Suspiciously short.
Well, everything else is shorter than Hamlet or
Yeah.
Richard III too.
Yeah.
But
And yeah.
yeah, so it's not clear. Maybe there was a longer Shakespearean version that was cut down. Maybe there never was. Maybe this is it.
Well, let's see. With Hamlet, it's the first quarto short, second very big, and the folio smaller but big.
Yeah, plus or
And
minus 300 lines. They're up around
yeah,
3,600 lines,
yeah.
and the first
And
quarto is about 1,700, 1,600, something like
well,
that.
and I'm sure the editors there were under the same pressure that you were talking about with the Arden series. You know that
Oh
we're
yeah,
trying to get everything into one book here, guys. Let's see
right.
what we. Yeah,
We have to get everything into one playable version in an hour and 20 minutes in the town
yeah,
square in Stratford. So
yeah,
what are we gonna put on?
yeah.
We're gonna put
Yes,
on the 4 hours of Richard III? No,
yes.
let's do the wooing of Lady Anne, and the murder and the fight with Richmond at the end. That's enough. That's an hour and a half.
Yeah. Yes, yes. When you put these things on the stage and you try to keep them in the public eye, there are a lot of practical reasons to cut down on text. I spoke with Emma Smith and Tiffany about
Yeah.
these things where
Hmm.
if it's these jokes and comedies where you go, okay, guys, let's just don't try to do this. And you see Branagh doing it in his film version of Much Ado,
Yes.
cutting out some of the banter there that to us might even seem, even if we understand it, a little tiresome. They go on a little too long sometimes
Hmm.
with the jokes, but I'm sure at the time they played very well. You know, they
Yeah.
were being referring to various people you knew about or whatnot.
Well, but it brings up the whole question of, and again, this is part of the theory of adaptation, is that every performance, every production of any play has cut or added text or has added interpretive moves that contradict or undermine or support the text in ways that are constantly changing. And I I think I point out in the book that I have never seen any account, one account in 1821 by J.C. Cross's parody of the play in which Edward the Confessor
The
scene
Confessor, yeah.
takes place, in which the guy comes out and says, "Oh, the doctor comes out and says, in the healing grace and the benediction, and he cures the sick." I've that's never I don't I've never seen a record of a performance of that. That's just cut, because who
Yeah.
was Edward, for a modern audience? Who was
Who
Edward
is
the
Edward the
Confessor?
Confessor? Right.
you know,
Uh,
or
yeah.
it,
Gary Taylor did something on. Did I get that
yes,
correct?
he argues that he rewrote the scene in his Middleton
Okay.
edition
Yeah.
so that he imagines how the scene, he thinks, originally existed, in which Edward did come in, but Middleton changed it all because it was too Catholic.
Uh-huh.
I don't really accept that argument. We have what we have,
Yeah.
and I don't really buy the argument that Shakespeare was cool with Catholic practice and Middleton wasn't, because Queen Elizabeth had done it. Queen Elizabeth had done the touching of the sick, healing the sick through the royal touch,
Yeah.
and had perfected the ceremony as a Protestant ceremony that used all kinds of elements of the Virgin, of the worship, the adoration of the Virgin Mary, but
Yeah.
had, as it were, Protestantized it in
Yes.
in her own way, and that became a big deal when James became king because he didn't believe in it. He was skeptical.
Yeah.
His advisors said, "You ought to do this because it proves that you're really the English king, because only the English kings have this power, not the Scottish kings."
Yeah.
And so eventually he came around. And he started, he would touch people, but he obviously was skeptical. So this
Yeah.
was sort of in the air in 1605-6,
Yeah.
along with the witchcraft trials and James presiding over witchcraft trials at the period.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
yeah, on that subject of religion, and that's where I don't think you can make things contemporary. I think a modern
yeah,
day practicing someone in a Roman Catholic tradition, as opposed to someone who's a Presbyterian or a Methodist in the regular old Protestant church or whatnot, it's hugely different. In my
right.
reading in the 16th, early 17th century,
Yes,
that and I'm seeing more of this in my own research, where you see Protestant writers actually doing things that we would now see to be more or less Catholic practice.
sure, sure.
Kind of making up their own book of hours and making up their own kind of
Hmm.
thing, but keeping the Pope out of it. And
Right.
and then there are other guys who just want to go and just be entrepreneurs and just stand up and do anything they want to do. So
Well, it
it's
was it was it was a deep. I mean, it's true, and just I, as I in the chapter in which I talk about Fleance, who is brought back in so many versions when he's not actually in the play, um, there is a kind of underlying uh, problem with that because Fleance actually goes off to he goes to Wales and he dies, and he never comes back. His son comes back 5 generations later.
yeah.
Um, but who in any audience from 1900 on or 1800 on is going to know anything about Fleance and what happened to him in Wales? They're not going to know about that.
Yeah.
And so I can see why adapters have brought him back. I don't.
Yeah.
I think it's a mistake. I think the play is open ended in a way that forecloses. It brings. I use the term open frame, closed frame play,
Yeah. Yeah.
bringing Fleance back or Donalbain, but mostly it's
Donald Bain. Yeah.
Fleance, uh, is a way of closing the frame of the
Yeah.
play and fulfilling the last prophecy. But the prophecy wasn't that Fleance would become king, but that those who descended from him would become king.
It,
At any rate, I see the same problem with the religious issues that you've just pointed out.
yeah.
No one in a contemporary world is going to appreciate the subtleties of whether or not hanging a royal coin around and touching someone is a particularly Catholic or Protestant, or the problems. James was Protestant, but his wife was Catholic, and all of that. That's the academic side of the.
How high the altar should be or what you should wear
Yeah,
while you're preaching.
exactly.
All of those things, these guys would,
Yes.
I mean, they just would argue
Yeah.
for hours. They would not unrelenting. Well, back to Fleance. I just had a little bit of the Joel Cohen production, the recent one. I think
Yes.
Fleance is at the end. There's a suggestion that that was Fleance, right? At the end,
Yes.
it's
They're
right.
back.
Okay.
He's
I
back.
thought that was a very good way to handle it. Uh, you,
He's coming back, but you don't
yeah,
actually see him get back.
yeah,
You see all the
yeah,
crows, fly up into the
yeah,
sky. But he's bringing him back.
yeah. And the crows do not suggest that there has been that everything's peaceful and good again.
No, they're not a good
Things,
sign. It's not a
they're
good
not.
sign.
It's not a good sign.
Or the ravens. I
The
guess they're
ravens.
ravens, not crows. Not a
Uh,
good sign.
And
He
I love that effect. I showed it to a class, and when they first flew over, my students just they ducked.
It's
Yeah,
Hitchcock, right?
yeah,
Well, it's a shame that film came out after I had turned in the manuscript. because I would have
Isn't
loved.
that a thing? You know,
Yeah,
the part of the stream you have to get off the boat at some point, and
you gotta
then
stop,
you
right?
know, uh, and it's already in press, and then this big movie comes out. But that's always going to be the case.
Yeah,
Something big is
right.
going to happen, and you're spread out across the globe. So, you know, as we're talking now, somebody's doing Macbeth
Oh yeah,
somewhere.
many people are doing Macbeth somewhere. Well, I was fortunate that just before I was turning in the manuscript, Amazon Prime put up that Indian film Joji, which
Mhm.
is the first pandemic version, only full film version I know that alludes to the pandemic. That is a version
Mhm.
of an adaptation of Macbeth. I mean, it's got a little King Lear in it as well, but
Mhm.
it's basically a Macbeth film. And I was just able to get that in.
Yes.
Uh, it's a very interesting film, and they use the masks we still wear for COVID,
Oh yeah.
as a metaphor for the hiddenness of the motives of the faces and so on. It's
Yes.
quite an interesting film. I don't know if it's still on Amazon, but if you get a chance to see it,
I haven't
take a
seen it
look.
yet. I would love to. That's on my list.
Yeah,
That this pandemic thing also, uh, to go back to the Ankhat business,
yeah,
I always, in teaching Romeo and Juliet, the text, I always thought this is the most ridiculous ending in the world, that this a junior friar or whatnot gets locked up in a plague house, and that's why the letter doesn't get there.
right,
And Zeffirelli handled that much better. You know, you just pass on the road and it's just you just don't see each other, right?
right.
And this pandemic, this now that ending makes perfect sense. And of course, the
Right.
plague came out so close to an outbreak of plague and so forth that it just is, vindicated the sort of earlier version.
Right. Actually, I think the Baz Luhrmann film does that even better because it's a UPS truck. Well, maybe
Yes,
it's a FedEx.
that's
It's a
right. The Fed,
FedEx,
and,
but
yeah,
they
and
just
Romeo's out
misses.
being Romeo, and he just doesn't see the
Right. The
package.
delivery misses him because we.
Which that's right. That's happened to all of us. We
Yes,
haven't. You're
exactly.
not at home when the package
It was
gets
stolen
there.
from his porch,
It's still
actually.
on his porch. That really is funny. Um, well, that's just great. I think that we are getting close to we've covered what I wanted to cover, and
Mhm.
we could talk about Macbeth forever. I would,
Yes.
it's just and what Macbeth is, what Macbeth represents, and it is something that I think is far more accessible than the other tragedies. I think it's one of those portals to
Yeah.
Shakespeare that if you started somebody on Shakespeare tragedy, the go-to is Macbeth. It certainly isn't Hamlet or Lear.
Well,
You could,
I think I agree with you, but uh, I've had very different um, successes and failures with teaching undergraduates, particularly
yeah,
any of those four plays. I mean, some years ago, I would have said, well, Othello is the least accessible because, in a way, the language is so difficult. I think
yeah,
it's a difficult play. But now, with its racial politics and problems, it's people really respond to it.
yeah.
I would think actually King Lear might be the most difficult play for a young person to take in. I remember reading it when I was 20 years old in college, and I didn't get it.
I
And
didn't either. I didn't either. I said there's some really good poetry in here, some
yeah,
good nature stuff, but and a production. I saw a production at Stratford upon Avon years ago, and it was very well done. And I would just please end this and get to the pub and not have to think about this anymore. It was so long, and it's Lear,
yeah,
and I just wasn't in that kind of mood that day.
right. But once you pass 50, it all makes sense.
It all makes sense.
As you're
Yes.
zooming towards Lear's age,
Yeah.
it
Well,
really makes
I
sense.
tell my students that Hamlet is going out, with the pandemic. It's just too much. It's just too close.
Yeah.
All of this business of being worm food and all, I just don't want to think about that. We're going to go to comedies. I know there are dark spots in the comedies too, but
Well,
I think,
yes,
yeah.
that
So
certainly are.
but it's just not worm worm food all the way through,
Yeah.
and as we are in Hamlet. Othello also, I think there's a competition depending on where you are in terms of, because jealousy is so eternal. It
Yeah.
never goes, and the scaling of jealousy in that play, that's another subject. But I
And
guess
it's
Macbeth,
and it's a domestic tragedy as well.
yeah, and it
You know,
is. It surely is.
but
Uh,
you're right about Macbeth because in terms of its, you might say, its approachability, its accessibility. Um, you don't have to believe in ghosts or witches or anything to get into that play,
yeah,
and the characters are immediately they're never transparent, but they're immediately visible in a way that takes they're not opaque in the way that, say, Othello himself is.
right.
um, and you can get at them. And there are things missing. There are problems. There are things you don't understand. Why is Lady Macbeth doing this? Surely it's not because she's a hysterical woman, as many versions have her.
Yeah,
But you can get at something quite quickly in that play, and it's not just because it's short. It's just somehow more available, even though some of the lines are completely opaque and difficult. If you really look at some of the lines in it, they're
yeah.
really strange.
They
The
really
crow,
are.
the
They
crow
really
makes
are.
wing to the rooky wood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
Um, the multitudinous seas incarnadine. There's some really amazing lines in it that
it's,
you can't just pick up as you're listening if you're the first time reader of the play or watching it. But there is something elemental. I think you used that phrase a long time, an hour ago. Something elemental
yeah,
about the play
yeah,
on in many different categories
yeah,
of fear, guilt, ambition, violence, love,
yeah,
just all kinds of things that are just right there.
yeah.
And
That young people understand too.
Oh,
What
absolutely.
what price you have to pay to get what you want,
Right.
and they understand that.
I do think that Macbeth is one of the darkest plays of Shakespeare
Yeah.
in terms of
Oh
being
yeah.
under the violent surface,
Yeah.
even more scary and violent than you might think. I think
Yeah.
it's really tapped into something, and that's one reason why it's been so well, popular is, I guess, the word
Yeah.
since the 17th century.
Well, I did have one short story I wanted to impart to
Yeah,
you about the Polanski version that was so influential in my career. You know,
yeah.
you just don't get darker. The
Oh, that's a
witches
dark.
just don't get uh, scarier than Polanski. And I did venture to show this to or a section of it to a class, and afterwards, we had two young men just said, Mr. Dabbs, that was just too much.
Mm,
They were absolute, and I'm going. I don't think at that time there was a lot of talk about trigger warnings and that sort of
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
And I
Right,
would told my class, so listen, this is Shakespeare. It's all the trigger is pulled. I mean,
right.
it gets dark, it gets bad. If that's bothersome, I don't know what I can do. But Polanski's a little bit too much. I'm
Well, I don't know what you think about the Rupert Gould witches. I have a picture in the book of
yes. Oh,
them.
those are scary. Those are very scary.
I
Yes.
did a Shakespeare on film course in which we had this film, and nobody in the class knew anything about it. And I had five senior citizen auditors, a special program at BU. So I had a bunch of undergraduates and then five seniors, and they all came back the day after we were to see it, and they said, "What was that?" It was it was a slasher film. It was, like when the witch goes down and pulls out the heart of the beating heart. That
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
said I had to look away, and you don't usually say that about a Shakespeare play. I had to look away
Yeah.
because it was so violent.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
that competes there with Polanski.
and
And
because they're supposedly nurses or nuns who are supposed to heal you, to
yeah,
help you, it makes them even nastier.
even nastier.
So,
Uh, and all, I think maybe with me, it's the whole thing. I'm old enough to remember the whole Manson
oh
Sharon Tate
yeah,
thing, and it
absolutely,
sort of superimposes on my, and it was, I was very young, of a formative period, and these two things thrown together were just so dark. You remember, and I do too.
absolutely.
The whole Manson thing that was just like the end of the innocence in some ways. The whole um,
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
And the film that he made shortly thereafter,
that's it with those
um,
images and
yeah,
the
drag
images.
even just dragging. Remember the bear? He drags a dead
Yeah,
bear through
yeah,
the that has been in the bear baiting scene.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
There's a
pretty scary.
it's very scary, and the slaughter of the innocents. I
Well,
can't think.
now
Yeah.
we're all going to have nightmares then after
We're all gonna have
talking
nightmares
about
now,
this.
but I'm trying to let you go off and have some supper here.
Okay,
This is your evening and your Friday evening,
it
and
is. It
here
is.
you are. This is just a sign to our audience of just how nerdy we are on a Friday evening when you should be out celebrating, and I'm on Saturday morning. But the sacrifices we have to make to
Oh well,
for this
uh,
Shakespeare thing.
it's fun. I love talking about Shakespeare and Macbeth. So
If I could ask you to stay just a moment after we
sure.
finish recording, Bill, it's been a wonderful experience. I'm so happy to meet you, and
Yes, thank you.
this is our first meeting, and just my best to you as we enter into the holiday season.
And you too. And you
Uh,
too. Thank you very much for having me.